It was a quiet evening in the suburbs, the kind of night when the air carried a gentle chill, and most homes were glowing softly with warm lights. In one corner of the neighborhood, a young woman named Amina was walking her dog, Zeus, a German shepherd with a coat as dark as midnight, but eyes that sparkled with an unwavering loyalty. Amina, a striking figure of confidence and grace, had moved to this area a few months ago. Despite the initial stares and whispers, she carried herself with an air of resilience that made her impossible to ignore. Zeus, her constant companion, trotted beside her, his leash loosely held in her hand. He was more than just a pet. He was her guardian, her best friend, and in many ways her protector. They were inseparable, and Zeus had a keen sense for danger, always alert and attuned to his surroundings. As Amina rounded the corner to her home, she noticed something off. A car she hadn't seen before was parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, and the engine idled quietly. She felt the weight of unseen eyes on her, a feeling that set her instincts on edge. Zeus seemed to notice too. His ears perked, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. "Easy, boy," Amina murmured, patting his head to soothe him, though she couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. She quickened her pace, eager to get inside the safety of her home. What she didn't know was that the car wasn't just a random vehicle in the neighborhood. Inside sat three men, their expressions a mix of arrogance and malice. They had been watching her for days, tracking her movements, and convincing themselves they had found an easy target. Amina lived alone, they assumed, and they figured a woman like her, young, black, and unassuming in their prejudiced minds, would be too intimidated to fight back. "She's got that dog, though," one of them muttered, eyeing Zeus. The leader of the group, a wiry man with a scar running across his cheek, smirked. "It's just a dog. We'll handle it. Besides, this is our neighborhood. She doesn't belong here anyway." Their plan was simple. Break in, take whatever they wanted, and leave her too scared to even report it. They'd done it before, targeting people they thought wouldn't put up a fight. To them, it was just another score. But as the saying goes, not all plans go as expected. Later that night, Amina sat in her living room, unaware that her movements were still being watched. Zeus lay at her feet, his ears twitching at every creak and rustle. The atmosphere in the house was calm, yet there was an undercurrent of tension neither Amina nor Zeus could fully ignore. Outside, the men made their move. They parked their car down the street to avoid suspicion and approached the house on foot, dressed in dark clothing to blend into the shadows. The leader, armed with a crowbar, motioned for the others to follow. They had done their research. They knew the layout of her home, the location of her bedroom, and the valuables they planned to take. As they crept closer, Zeus stirred. His body went rigid, and he let out a sharp bark, his instincts kicking into high gear. Amina sat up, her heart racing. "What is it, Zeus?" She whispered, moving toward the window to peek outside. She saw nothing at first, but the unease from earlier returned with full force. Then she heard it, a faint clink like metal against glass. Someone was trying to break in. Amina's mind raced. She wasn't the type to panic easily, but she knew this wasn't an accident. Grabbing her phone, she quickly dialed 911, while trying to keep her movements quiet. Zeus, however, was already at the door, his growls growing louder and more menacing. The men outside hesitated for a moment, hearing the dog, but the leader waved them on. "It's just noise. We're here now. Let's move." As the lock on the door clicked open, the men pushed inside, expecting chaos but prepared to overpower a lone woman. What they didn't expect was Zeus, now fully in protective mode. With a ferocious bark, he lunged toward the first man through the door, his teeth bared and eyes blazing. Amina, clutching her phone and watching the scene unfold, felt a surge of fear and adrenaline. Zeus had always been her protector, but she'd never seen him like this, utterly fearless and ready to defend her at all costs. The men, caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the dog, scrambled to regain control. One of them swung a flashlight in Zeus' direction, but the dog dodged with lightning speed, his growls vibrating through the room like a warning bell. And then, just as the leader tried to shout orders, the unmistakable sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Amina's voice was calm but firm as she stood her ground. You picked the wrong house. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching into eternity as the sirens closed in. The men realized too late that their underestimation of Amina and her fiercely loyal dog had been their gravest mistake. The sharp wail of approaching sirens echoed through the quiet neighborhood, cutting through the tension in Amina's home. The men, now trapped between their desperation to escape and their disbelief at how quickly things had spiraled out of control, froze for a moment. Zeus stood firm, his teeth bared and body coiled like a spring ready to launch again if necessary. His growls rumbled low and steady, a chilling promise that he wasn't done yet. The leader of the group cursed under his breath. This was supposed to be easy. In his mind, Amina had been an ideal target, isolated, quiet, unthreatening. He hadn't counted on the dog, and he certainly hadn't expected her to act so decisively. It was clear now that they had made a mistake, but pride and fear kept him rooted in place, unwilling to back down entirely. Grab what you can and let's go, he hissed at the others, his voice barely audible over the sound of Zeus's snarls. One of his accomplices hesitated, clearly unnerved by the dog, but the third man began rifling through a shelf near the door, grabbing anything he could shove into his backpack. Amina stood a few feet away, clutching her phone tightly as she remained on the line with the 911 dispatcher. Her voice was steady, though her pulse raced with adrenaline. Yes, they're inside now. My dog is holding them off. Please hurry, she said, her tone firm but calm. She glanced at Zeus, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and gratitude. He was her guardian angel in that moment, and she knew he wouldn't let anyone harm her. Outside, the sirens grew louder, and the flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the walls of the living room. The men panicked. The one closest to the door dropped the flashlight he'd been holding, its clatter startling the group. Zeus lunged slightly forward, teeth snapping in warning, and the man stumbled backward, falling against the wall. Call him off, the leader barked at Amina, his voice edged with desperation. Call him off or what? Amina interrupted sharply, her eyes locking with his. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her words silenced him. You've already lost. The police are here, and you're not going anywhere. The leader stared at her, his bravado faltering for the first time. He glanced toward the door, gauging his chances of making a run for it. But Zeus's presence was an undeniable deterrent. Even if they managed to get past the dog, the cops were moments away from storming the house. The tension in the room was unbearable as the first set of footsteps approached the front door. Amina exhaled slowly, her hands trembling as the weight of the situation fully sank in. She had never imagined something like this happening, but there she was, facing it head-on, and she wasn't alone. The police burst through the door, weapons drawn, their voices commanding and firm, as they ordered the intruders to the ground. Zeus, sensing the shift in energy, stepped back slightly, his growls fading, but his eyes never leaving the men. Amina felt a wave of relief wash over her as the officers took control of the scene, handcuffing the intruders and leading them outside one by one. But as the adrenaline began to subside, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this wasn't just a random break-in. There was something calculated about it, something personal. The way the men had been watching her, the way they had spoken to each other, it all pointed to a deeper motive. The officer in charge, a tall man with a kind but serious demeanor, approached her. Are you okay, Mum? He asked, his voice gentle. Amina nodded, though her hands were still shaking. I think so, she replied. Thank you for coming so quickly. I don't know what would have happened if Zeus hadn't been here. The officer glanced down at the dog, who was now sitting calmly at Amina's feet, his tail wagging slightly as if the chaos of the last few minutes had already been forgotten. You've a good dog here, he said with a small smile. He's a hero tonight. Amina managed a faint smile in return, but her mind was still racing. She wanted answers. Who were these men, and why had they targeted her? As the officers escorted the intruders out to the waiting patrol cars, she caught a glimpse of the leader's face. He was staring at her, his expression a mix of anger and something else. Something she couldn't quite place. It sent a chill down her spine. Once the house was clear and the immediate danger had passed, the officer in charge returned to take her statement. Amina recounted everything she could remember, from the strange car parked outside to the moment Zeus had alerted her to the break-in. The officer listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally nodding. "Do you recognize any of them?" he asked when she finished. "Have you seen them around the neighborhood before?" Amina shook her head. "No, I don't think so. But I had this feeling earlier, like someone was watching me. It's not the first time I felt that way since I moved here." The officer's brow furrowed. "Have there been any other incidents? Anything unusual?" She hesitated, thinking back to the last few weeks. There had been small things, mail going missing, strange noises outside her house at night, a sense of being watched when she walked Zeus around the block. She had brushed them off at the time, chalking them up to paranoia or coincidence. But now, in light of what had just happened, they took on a more sinister significance. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe. I didn't think much of it before, but now, I'm not sure." The officer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, we'll have patrols in the area, and I'd recommend installing some security cameras if you don't already have them." "I will," Amina said, her voice resolute. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her life, but she also wasn't going to ignore the warning signs anymore. Something was going on, and she intended to find out what. As the police finished their work and the house grew quiet again, Amina sat on the couch with Zeus by her side. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her mind still replaying the events of the night. The men had underestimated her, thinking she was an easy target. They hadn't counted on her strength, her quick thinking, or the unwavering loyalty of her dog. But as much as she wanted to believe the worst was over, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The house was finally quiet, but the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on Amina's chest. She couldn't stop replaying the events of the night in her mind, piecing them together like fragments of a puzzle that refused to fit. Zeus lay stretched out beside her, his breathing steady, but every so often, his ears twitched as if he too was still on alert. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a creeping unease that wouldn't let her rest. She stood up and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The street was empty now, the flashing lights and police cars long gone. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be out there watching. Her eyes lingered on the dark corners of the yard, scanning for any signs of movement. She saw nothing, but it didn't ease her mind. The police had taken the men away, but their presence still lingered like a shadow in her home. She could still hear the leader's voice, his demand for her to call Zeus off, and the look in his eyes as he was led away. It wasn't just anger. It was something darker, something that felt personal. But why? She didn't know them, and as far as she could tell, they didn't know her either. At least, not in the way she'd know a neighbor or a coworker. She sat back down and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her messages and social media, searching for distraction. Instead, she found herself opening her email, her finger hovering over a particular message she hadn't opened yet. It was from her boss, reminding her about the promotion she recently earned, a big step forward in her career. It had come with more responsibility and a bigger paycheck, but it had also come with attention she wasn't entirely comfortable with. She'd heard whispers around the office, hints of jealousy from some of her colleagues. Was it possible someone from work had something to do with this? The thought sent a chill through her, but she pushed it aside. That felt too far-fetched. Instead, her mind wandered to her neighbors. Most of them had been polite, but there were a few who hadn't gone out of their way to welcome her. A couple of assy stares, a handful of murmured comments she'd overheard when she first moved in. She had tried not to dwell on it, brushing it off as discomfort with new faces. But now, with everything that had happened, she wasn't so sure. Could someone in the neighborhood have tipped off those men? told them she lived alone, made her sound like an easy target. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden bark from Zeus. She jumped slightly, her heart pounding, and looked at him. He was standing now, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the front door. Amina followed his gaze, straining to hear whatever it was that had caught his attention. For a moment, there was nothing. Then faintly she heard it, a soft rustling, like leaves brushing against each other. It could have been the wind, but something about it felt deliberate. She grabbed her phone and walked over to the door, her hand resting on the doorknob as she debated whether to open it. Zeus moved beside her, his posture protective, his ears perked. She decided against opening the door and instead turned on the porch light. The sudden brightness illuminated the yard, revealing nothing but the swaying branches of the trees. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. The next morning, Amina woke up feeling exhausted. She hadn't slept much, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. After a quick shower and breakfast, she decided to take Zeus on their usual walk. The fresh air might clear her head, she thought, and Zeus deserved some time to run and play after the stressful night they'd had. As they walked through the neighborhood, Amina noticed a few of her neighbors watching her. One man, Mr. Carter, who lived 2 houses down, waved at her from his driveway. He was an older man with kind eyes and a warm smile, always offering to help her with little things like carrying groceries or fixing a squeaky gate. She waved back, feeling a small sense of comfort in his presence. But further down the street, she spotted another neighbor, Mrs. Lane, peeking out from behind her curtains. The older woman quickly ducked out of sight when Amina glanced her way, making her stomach twist with unease. She'd never had a bad interaction with Mrs. Lane, but the woman had always been distant, her face tight with disapproval whenever Amina passed by. Was it possible she had seen something the night before? Or worse, could she have been involved? Zeus suddenly stopped, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Amina followed his gaze and saw a small group of people gathered on the corner. They were talking quietly, their heads close together, but they fell silent when they noticed her. One of them, a man she recognized as living on the next street over, gave her a curt nod before walking away. The others followed, leaving Amina feeling more isolated than ever. By the time she returned home, her unease had deepened. She couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play, that the break-in was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. But without any concrete evidence, all she had were suspicions and questions. As she locked the door behind her, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. The message was short and cryptic. Asterisk, stay alert. Not everyone is who they seem, asterisk. Amina stared at the screen, her mind racing. Who had sent this? Was it a warning? A threat? And how did they know her number? She quickly typed back, asterisk, who is this asterisk? But there was no reply. Her grip on the phone tightened as she felt the weight of unseen forces closing in. Someone knew more than they were letting on, and it was clear now that she couldn't face this alone. Whatever was happening, Amina was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant stepping into the darkness herself. Amina couldn't stop staring at the cryptic message on her phone. The words repeated in her mind like a haunting melody. Asterisk, stay alert. Not everyone is who they seem. Asterisk, her heart raced as she considered the possibilities. Was it from someone trying to help her? Or was it another layer of the threat she now felt surrounding her? She had no way of knowing, and the silence from the unknown sender only deepened her unease. Zeus, ever watchful, followed her as she paced the living room. His sharp eyes tracked her movements, his ears twitching at every small sound. He seemed to sense her anxiety, staying close to her side, as if ready to defend her from an invisible enemy. She placed her hand on his head, his steady presence grounding her for a moment. Determined not to be paralyzed by fear, Amina decided to take action. The first step was reviewing the footage from the small security camera she had installed outside her house a few weeks after moving in. She had almost forgotten about it until now. She opened her laptop, accessing the recordings from the previous night. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad, her stomach twisting as the grainy images began to play. The footage started off uneventfully, the street lights casting a faint glow on the quiet street, the occasional passing car. But then, just after midnight, she saw it, the same car she noticed earlier that evening. It drove slowly past her house, pausing for several seconds before moving down the street and out of view. A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't just coincidence. They had been scouting her home. A few minutes later, the men appeared on the screen, moving with precision and familiarity. They didn't hesitate as they approached her house, one of them pulling out tools to pick the lock. It was methodical, practiced. But something else caught her attention. Just before they stepped onto her porch, one of them glanced over his shoulder, as if looking for approval. Following his gaze, the camera captured the faint silhouette of someone standing further down the street, almost hidden in the shadows. Amina froze. There was someone else. Whoever it was hadn't come near the house, but they had been there watching. It wasn't one of the men who had been caught. This person remained unidentified. Her breath quickened as she rewound the footage, trying to get a clearer look, but the figure was too far away to make out any details. She sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Who was that person? Were they working with the intruders, or were they watching for a different reason? And why hadn't the police mentioned anything about a lookout? The questions were endless, each one more unsettling than the last. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time, it was a call from the officer who had taken her statement the night before. She answered quickly, hoping he had new information. "We've started questioning the suspects," he said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "But they're not saying much. They're sticking to their story that it was just a random robbery, but we're not convinced. Something about this doesn't add up." Amina hesitated before responding, debating whether to tell him about the figure in the footage. "I looked at my security camera," she said finally. "There was someone else outside, further down the street. They weren't part of the group that broke in, but they were watching." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Can you send us the footage?" the officer asked, his tone sharpening with interest. "Of course," Amina said. "I'll send it right away." After hanging up, she uploaded the video and emailed it to the officer. She hoped it would lead to answers, but deep down, she wasn't sure how much she trusted the police to solve this. It felt bigger than a simple break-in, more personal. There was a sense of being targeted, and she couldn't shake it. The day dragged on, every noise outside making her jump, every shadow seeming to move. By evening, her nerves were frayed. Zeus remained vigilant, staying near the front door as if anticipating another threat. Amina tried to distract herself, but her mind kept circling back to the mysterious figure and the cryptic text message. As darkness fell, she heard a knock at her door. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she froze. Zeus growled softly, his body tense. She grabbed her phone and approached the door cautiously, looking through the peephole. To her relief, it was Mr. Carter, her neighbor. He held a small package in his hands, his expression friendly but concerned. Amina opened the door slightly, keeping the chain lock in place. "Hi, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady but worry. "What can I do for you?" "Sorry to bother you, Amina," he said, his tone warm. "This was delivered to my house by mistake. I thought I'd bring it over." She smiled faintly, opening the door wider to take the package. "Thank you. I appreciate it." As he handed it to her, his expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. "I heard about what happened last night," he said quietly. "I just wanted to check on you, make sure you're doing okay." Amina hesitated, caught off guard by his concern. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her lingering unease. "It's been a lot." Mr. Carter nodded, his brow furrowing. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to let me know," he said. "This neighborhood can be complicated sometimes. Not everyone here is as welcoming as they should be." She nodded, unsure how to respond. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but he didn't elaborate. After a moment, he gave her a reassuring smile and walked back toward his house. Amina closed the door, locking it behind her. Zeus followed her back to the living room, where she set the package on the table. She stared at it for a moment, her mind spinning. Something about Mr. Carter's words had unsettled her. Was he trying to warn her, or was he simply being kind? As she reached for the package to open it, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. Asterisk, you're being watched. Be careful who you trust, asterisk. Amina's blood ran cold. She looked at the package again, then at Zeus, who was now growling softly, his eyes fixed on the window. The tension in the air was suffocating, and she felt the walls closing in. She wasn't sure who to trust anymore, but one thing was clear. Someone was watching, and they weren't done yet. Amina stared at the phone, the message blurring as her mind raced. Asterisk, you're being watched. Be careful who you trust, asterisk. The words echoed in her head, louder than the pounding of her heart. The package sat unopened on the table, an unspoken question that felt too dangerous to answer just yet. Zeus's low growl deepened, pulling her back to the present. His gaze was fixed on the window, his body rigid with tension. Her hand shook as she reached for the curtains, drawing them back just enough to peek outside. The street looked quiet under the dim glow of the streetlights. But that didn't mean she was alone. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every tree branch rustling in the breeze felt like a signal. Amina stepped back from the window, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. She turned her attention to the package. Her fingers hesitated over the tape, the possibility of it being something more sinister weighing heavily on her. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully sliced it open. Inside, she found a single manila folder, unmarked and seemingly harmless. But as she pulled it out and opened it, her stomach dropped. The folder contained photographs, dozens of them, all of her. Some were from her daily walks with Zeus, others from her office parking lot, and a few from her backyard. Each image was dated, and the most recent one was from just 2 days ago. A chill ran through her as she realized the level of surveillance she had been under without even knowing it. These weren't random pictures. They were methodical, tracking her movements and habits. Beneath the photographs was a handwritten note on plain white paper. The writing was blocky and deliberate, as though the person had taken their time crafting every letter. It read, asterisk, you should have stayed quiet. Now, it's too late, asterisk. Amina's breath caught in her throat. What did they mean by stayed quiet? Was this connected to her work, her promotion, or something she didn't even realize she had stumbled into? The weight of the words made her legs feel unsteady, and she sat down, gripping the edge of the table for support. Before she could process the implications, Zeus let out a sharp bark, startling her. He ran to the front door, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor as he threw himself against it, barking furiously. Amina's pulse skyrocketed. She grabbed her phone and quickly dialed the officer she had spoken to earlier. The call went straight to voicemail. Panic bubbled in her chest as she hung up and dialed 911 instead. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but it did little to soothe her. What is your emergency? They asked. There's someone outside my house, Amina said, her voice trembling. They've been watching me, and now my dog is going crazy at the door. The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way and instructed her to stay on the line. Amina backed away from the door, her eyes darting between it and the windows. Zeus continued barking, his deep, guttural sounds echoing through the house. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. 3 sharp, deliberate raps sent a jolt of fear through her. Zeus's barking grew more frenzied, his body pressing against the door as though he could break through it. Amina gripped her phone tighter, her voice shaking as she whispered to the dispatcher, "Someone's here." "Stay where you are," the dispatcher said firmly. "The officers are close." The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. Amina held her breath, straining to hear any sound that might indicate who, or what, was on the other side. She thought she heard faint footsteps retreating, but it was hard to tell over Zeus's growls. Minutes felt like hours before she finally heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief washed over her as the flashing blue and red lights illuminated her street. She quickly unlocked the door to let the officers in, keeping Zeus close at her side. The officers swept through the house and yard, but whoever had been outside was gone, leaving no trace behind. After taking her statement, one of the officers, a younger man with a kind but serious expression, asked about the folder on the table. Amina hesitated before handing it to him, watching his face darken as he flipped through the photographs and read the note. "This isn't just a random break-in," he said, his tone grave. "Someone's been targeting you for a while." Amina nodded, her fears now confirmed. "But why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand what they want." The officer shook his head. "We'll investigate this further, but for now, you need to stay somewhere safe. This doesn't feel like it's over." As the officers left, Amina felt a sinking sense of dread. They didn't have any answers, and she wasn't sure they ever would. She packed a small bag, grabbed Zeus's leash, and decided to stay at a hotel for the night. But as she locked up the house and walked to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her. As she drove away, the headlights of another car flickered on in the distance, trailing her at a careful distance. Amina glanced in the rearview mirror, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. The game wasn't over. If anything, it was only just beginning. Amina kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her pulse racing as the car behind her maintained its distance. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. Whoever was in that vehicle wanted her to know they were following. Zeus sat alert in the passenger seat, his ears twitching as though he too sensed the tension. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. The hotel she had booked was only a few miles away, but every minute felt like an eternity. She decided to take a detour, turning off onto a smaller road to see if the car would follow. Sure enough, its headlights mirrored her movements. Her stomach churned as she realized she couldn't lead them to the hotel. Instead, she turned toward a nearby shopping plaza, hoping the bright lights and potential witnesses would deter whoever was behind her. Pulling into the nearly empty parking lot, she parked near the entrance of a 24-hour convenience store. The other car stopped a few spaces away, but didn't move closer. Amina hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. Zeus growled low in his throat, his gaze locked on the car. She decided to make a move, grabbing her phone and stepping out with Zeus at her side. As she walked toward the store, the driver's side door of the other car opened. A tall figure stepped out, silhouetted by the streetlights. Amina's heart pounded as the person began walking toward her, their pace slow and deliberate. Zeus barked loudly, his stance protective, but she didn't back down. She stood her ground, clutching her phone tightly, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button. The figure stopped a few feet away, raising their hands slightly in a gesture of surrender. "Amina," they said, their voice familiar but unexpected. "It's me, Carter." Her eyes widened in shock as her neighbor stepped into the light. "Mr. Carter, what are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice a mix of fear and confusion. "I need to explain," he said, his tone urgent. "You're in danger, and I've been trying to protect you." Amina took a step back, her mind racing. "Protect me? By following me in the middle of the night? That's not exactly comforting." Carter sighed, glancing around nervously. "There are things you don't know, things I couldn't tell you before. But you need to trust me now. Those men who broke into your house, they weren't just random criminals. They were hired." Her blood ran cold. Hired? By who? And why? Carter hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I don't know who exactly, but it's someone connected to your promotion at work. There's something going on in your company, something big, and they think you stumbled onto it." Amina's mind raced, flashes of recent events coming together like puzzle pieces. The odd looks at the office, the cryptic comments from certain coworkers, the feeling that she was being watched even before the break-in. "Why would they target me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know anything." "They think you do," Carter said. "Or they think you're close to finding out. Either way, they're trying to scare you into silence. Or worse. Before Amina could respond, Zeus barked again, his body tense. She turned to see another car pulling into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Carter's expression hardened as he stepped closer to her. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, the second car's doors opened and two men stepped out. Amina recognized one of them as the leader of the group that had broken into her house. Her heart dropped as she realized the police must have released him, or worse, he had never really been in custody. The man smirked as he approached, his movements casual but menacing. "Looks like you didn't take the hint, lady," he said. "That's a shame." Carter moved in front of Amina, his stance protective. "You don't want to do this," he said firmly. "The police are already involved." The man laughed. "The police? Please, they can't stop what's coming." Zeus snarled, his bark sharp and ferocious, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out a phone and pressed a button, and within seconds, the parking lot was flooded with the sound of tires screeching. Two more cars pulled in, boxing Amina and Carter in. Amina's chest tightened as panic set in. "What do we do?" she whispered, clutching Zeus's leash. Carter's jaw tightened. "Stay behind me, and trust your dog." The men began closing in, their confidence palpable. But just as one of them reached for Amina, Zeus lunged. His powerful jaws clamped down on the man's arm, eliciting a scream of pain. Chaos erupted as Carter pulled a small canister from his pocket, spraying pepper spray at the other attackers. Amina ducked behind a car, her phone in hand as she frantically called 911. Zeus released the man and positioned himself between Amina and the others, his growls echoing in the tense air. The attackers hesitated, clearly unprepared for such fierce resistance. Carter took advantage of the moment, grabbing Amina's arm. "Run," he shouted. They sprinted toward the convenience store, Zeus staying close by. The attackers tried to follow, but the sound of sirens in the distance stopped them in their tracks. Amina turned to see them scrambling back to their cars, their retreat hurried and disorganized. Moments later, the police arrived, their presence flooding the lot with flashing lights and a sense of relief. The attackers were quickly apprehended, though a few managed to escape. Carter stayed by Amina's side, his face a mix of exhaustion and determination. As the officers questioned them, Carter finally revealed the truth. He was a private investigator, hired to look into corruption at Amina's company. He had been watching her, because she was unknowingly at the center of the case. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice sincere. "I was trying to keep you safe." Amina stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, gratitude, and disbelief. "You should have told me," she said quietly. "I didn't know who to trust." "I know," Carter said, "but you're safe now? And with your help, we can bring the people behind this to justice." As the officers led the remaining attackers away, Amina looked down at Zeus, who was now sitting calmly at her feet, his tail wagging slightly. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved me." But as the adrenaline began to fade, Amina couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The attackers were just pawns, and the real mastermind was still out there, watching and waiting. For now she was safe, but she knew the battle was far from finished.